Thank you for coming this morning and listening to me talk. My name is Amelia Abreu, and I'm a design researcher from Portland. I'm super happy to be here, and I'm super happy to follow Sarah's talk. So without further ado, let's talk about the next generation of developer experience and talk about why developer experience is more crucial than ever. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about who I am and why I'm talking to you about this. And I'll talk a little bit about the semantics of quote-unquote developer experience and what it means to speak from the user experience perspective with developer tools. And we'll talk about why now more than ever developer tools need to be friendly to a wide variety of users. I'll share some examples from my own work along the way, and then I'll conclude by talking about ways we can go from here. So I make my living as a design researcher, and I've been in this field for about 10 years, but about 5 years ago, I was working in an interactive agency, and I got called into a conference room, and the account manager was very concerned. And he was like, Amelia, we know that you have a CS degree, and we have to go work on a developer tool. And we were wondering if you could help us with this. And I was like, yeah, sure, I can talk to some engineers. And that was when I learned, in the words of Anil Dash, that being able to not work on an engineering team but talk to engineers is often a rare and mysterious skill. And prior to and alongside working in the UX and design research realm, I studied human-computer interaction in grad school at UW. And last year, after living in Portland and having a lot of folks come up to me and saying, you know, I really want to learn more about UX, but I don't really know what it is. I started UX Night School, a fun, experiential learning program for folks who work in design and tech, but maybe have never, who have responsibilities in the user experience. And I think another introductory note I want to make is that I've spent a lot of time recently, if you know me or if just seen me ranting on the internet, thinking about care, labor, and equity. Because I've been in and around this world for about 10 years. And for the past 5 years, I've been the primary caregiver of my daughter. And observing the environment of the tech industry, I've felt a lot of loneliness around caregiving and a lot of devaluation around the work of care. And I reached this point where I was really burned out, and I'd been working on projects with teams that were really dysfunctional in ways that we don't need to discuss here, and we can probably all imagine. And I realized that this was work that I could do that provided care, that building better learning experiences, building more efficient processes, meeting folks where they are is a very important act of care. So I've always felt a little bit weird about the term user experience. And to paraphrase Brenda Laurel, it goes around this demeaning little word, user. If I describe someone as a user, that's not a polite term. Oh, he's a user. And if I talk, the thing I like about working in developer experience is we get rid of that word user. But developer is not really the best description either. Because if we're going to talk about improving the developer experience of a tool, that leaves out the managers, the architects, the implementers, the supporters, everyone who doesn't go on to develop something with whatever framework or dashboard or tool you're building. And I was having this conversation with my friend Sarah Sharp, and who's worked on a lot of open source projects and who I've known for several years. And she said, yeah, I don't like that word either. I like to use the word contributor, because there's just a wide ecosystem of folks who work in and around any sort of software project, whether it's open source or not. And they're all contributing something. So I want to float that first. Let's think about how we can make the tools that we build, the tools that we implement, work well for all contributors, whether they're writing code or not. I also want to take a moment and pause and think about all of the cool shit that folks are building, especially with JavaScript libraries and JavaScript frameworks, who are not traditional software developers, who are not traditional software engineers, and how this is changing every day. This is an installation that is across from the World Cup Stadium in Seoul, and it was built by two artists who didn't have a computing background, but were able to use, I believe, I'm blanking, but we used several different JavaScript tools to develop these visualizations. And I think about this. This is Rachel Weitz, who's a developer evangelist at Microsoft. She built this really weird, cool hand, like fake hand with an Arduino. And I think about this, and this is so cool to me, because the next generation of connected devices will be beyond the realm of what we've traditionally considered to be computing. They'll look different. They'll be perceived, they'll be conceived by folks who don't have a lot of formal computing background. And these are the next generation of developers. So I look forward to, more weirdness to come. Even if my corporate hardware clients clutch their pearls. Sorry, I just clutched my mic. When they think about folks, even, quote unquote, web devs writing server-side code. Because in this next generation of developers, things are going to look a lot different. And this diversity is our strength. No longer can we think, oh, we're just building things for people who look like us, who live in environments like us, who think like us. I never have ever felt like I was one of that us, which is, part of what inspires me to do this work. But also, I think we've reached a watershed moment. We have global industry growth. I was chatting with a colleague about the growth of development in China. And he said, yeah, we get this figure that there's 20 million developers in China, but the main developer listserv for conferences in China has 45 million subscribers. And the growth of the software industry in places like Malaysia, places like Brazil, places like India, combined with the fact that there are more ways than ever to learn and apply and become a software developer, means that we have to let go of a lot of our assumptions and a lot of our implicit ideas that what we build for us, and I'm talking about West Coast, English-speaking software developers, is going to work for the rest of the world, because it will not. And there's also, as I mentioned, just wider applications for new and re-envisioned frameworks. I spoke at an R conference a few months ago, and it was really awesome to hang out with scientists who were in their 50s and 60s, who were using R for computational biology, and who just had a completely different idea of what they would use a computational framework for, rather than the web developers or architects that I usually work with. And I probably don't need to make this point again, but we're in a phase of very rapidly shifting paradigms around what is software, what is hardware, what is, where does the code live? And this has a lot to do with IoT as well as other shifts in global manufacturing. And so to sum up this introductory part of this talk, I want to talk about how it's the experience. It's the experience for new developers and this added layer of trustworthiness and community, which really is the competitive difference in any tool or framework or solution that we're building or proposing. So that leads me to the next section of this talk. I work with a lot of engineers who are, I think justifiably dubious about, what do you mean by user experience? What do you mean by UX? Like, what do we even know about this? Like, why, what is the scientific basis of this and why should I care? And I like to say that I work on Homer J. Simpson problems because going back as far as ancient Greece, folks have modified tools to make them more usable to wider segments of the population. And around the turn of the Industrial Revolution, this came to be called ergonomics. And a lot of the classics, a lot of the knowledge-generating things that we know about the user experience actually don't come from what we would consider to be software applications. There are great studies that were done in the 1950s on pilots, on nuclear power operators, domains that I would call Homer Simpson domains. And this came to be called human factors engineering and interface design. I secretly love the term man-machine interaction, even though it is sexist, but it does get to this very base function of I'm a human and I have to deal with this machine. But I so often hear this argument, oh, well, good design is just intuitive. I'm like, bullshit. Good design is informed by humans. And when I teach folks and when I do workshops, I like to bring in like ye old classics. So this is from the year 2000, Jesse James Garrett's Elements of User Experience. And what I like about this, especially when I'm working with an engineering group, is that this shows pretty well how user experience happens at every level of the stack. So often, applications are determined by the database structure that are built into them. And I will come in as the UX designer, and they'll say, oh, can you improve the usability of this? And I say, how? The user flow has already been determined, and it doesn't really make sense to people who use it. And this is something that gets cited a lot. IBM did a meta-study in the 90s, and they found that early and targeted improvements in usability had up to a 20-to-1 ROI. And that number increased the earlier that designers and researchers were involved in the process. But what makes a system usable? This is another tool, ye old tool that I like to use. This is Jacob Nielsen's heuristic usability analysis, which actually the Kai paper that generated this is from 1990, so it's even older than 1995. But tools like this, and this is something that I love to work with people who don't consider themselves designers, allow us to put a vocabulary and put a framework around difficulties in using an application, using a framework, even using documentation for the first time, and for continued use. Because as I said, the user experience happens at every part of the stack. Just the command line prompts that when you install a new framework are already able to give us, to either direct you in the right way or not give you enough information. I'm obsessed with error messages as a form of user experience because, as we all know, error messages can direct you to a place, to saving time and figuring out what's what, or they can insult you. And I certainly don't need to bring up examples of insulting or confusing error messages. So moving forward, I want to think more about how do we put this all together? How do we actually start in building tools for other developers that are not just tools for ourselves, and taking a more holistic, iterative, considered approach towards building tools for other devs. And I think about, one thing that I'm obsessed with transportation, as I think many geeks are. And I've been thinking a lot about the, automation and transportation over the past few years. And this is also not a new debate. These early studies about pilots that happened in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s brought into this question of like, what changes when we use autopilot? But I digress. So about a year ago, I was working with an in-house team in a Fortune 100 company, and they built a performance analytics dashboard. And there was a big engineering team that was very distributed, that whoever initially thought of the idea for this dashboard thought it could be used for all of the engineering teams. But usually when I come in, things are on fire. And they were like, yeah, nobody's using it. We don't know what to do to make it more appealing to the folks who are supposed to be using it. We went, it was pushing code. There were a lot of tools for code quality, for understanding team performance, for developing a more livable code base. I think that was all in their mind when they were, these were all the best intentions. But the dashboard itself was very bloated. There was almost no documentation, and features just sort of got shipped. And even amongst the team that I was working with, there was not a lot of discussion about when was the time to ship features to the dashboard. Some folks, were able to push features when they built them because they were awesome. Some folks waited on the PM's approval. And I asked the question, well, when can we validate that people actually want these features? So how did we get out of this mess? We talked about impact, we talked about workflow. We looked at the tools that folks were actually using instead of the internal tool that folks had pushed. And then we used paper. I'm a big fan of paper prototyping. It makes a lot of software engineers cringe, but I find that it's often useful when there's a lot of ego on the line, when there's already been a lot of investment, and when there's a tendency towards perfectionism. Paper prototypes are never perfect, but they are, and there's a lot of thought that you have to put into drawing something and replicating something that's often different than when you're just coding it or designing it. And so we did a round of iterative usability tests where we figured out what folks were able to grok and what they weren't, and quickly changed things in between sessions. And in 5 usability tests, with real people, we uncovered a whole slew of problems. And this isn't just unique to my work. There was another meta-study done by the Nielsen-Norman group that found that just doing 5 usability tests uncovered 80% of user issues. So that's a pretty small investment to get a lot of direction. And we think, there's a lot of tendency towards, A/B testing, towards letting the numbers speak to that. And that approach works as well. But I often find that when we have a lot of metrics, when we have, when we have data from A/B tests, we still have the answers of the when and how much and what questions. We don't have the answers to the why. questions. And so I find that it's this interaction with other humans, often in a very, unfancy setting, that brings about, these insights that can really lead to better direction. So where do we go from here? I hope that I've given you some interesting perspectives, and I hope that we can chat more about improving developer experiences. But when you go back to work, what's your goal here? What are the next steps? The first exercise, or the first direction I would argue, is thinking about design principles and having these often tough discussions about what are we trying to do here? Who are we trying to bring to the table? Who is using our products, and how do we want to serve them? And this came out of a project I worked on with a hardware company, of these design principles for building tools for developers. And it came down to tell me, show me, and build community, which I think many of us in this room, this is not surprising. But how do you make things simple but not simplistic? How do you convey that, what the tool you're building is, why it's a good fit? How can you explain how something works that's not too beleaguered, but also, explains the most to the widest amount of people? And how can you show things in context? I often test API documentation and do usability tests on APIs. And I find, there's a very recognizable pattern where the developers we bring in to test the API go straight to the sample code. And I had this really great, this dude I loved came in to test it, and he said, this context, it's way more important than content. And I just love this. It's the contextual samples, it's the industry-specific implementation documentation that makes a big difference for folks. And I'm definitely preaching to the choir here about building the importance of community. But this is something that cannot happen overnight. And if you're building a new framework, if you're building a new product, community isn't something that you can piecemeal out. And how do we make our products better? We do it through engaging with community. And so that brings me to my last argument, is that we're not just building frameworks, we're not just building products, we're building human-centered services. And the best providers, the industry leaders in this realm know this. And I advocate for a service design approach. What does it mean to design services? The concept of service design came of age in Northern Europe in the 90s and early 2000s. And I really like this 5 points towards what it means to design services. It came out of the original Service Design Manifesto. So service design is user-centered, and this is something that is along the lines with what I advocate. But it involves not only development of products, but also the development of services around end users and stakeholders. Because, oftentimes and I think this is super important in developer experience, we often think that it is just the developer who's going to be using our tool, and not the managers, not the support engineers, not all of the other folks that are involved and have a stake in what's happening. The second principle of service design, that it's co-creative, and meaning that one single designer or developer is not the expert, cannot present a silver bullet in terms of building a better product or service. That in order to build better products and services, we need to bring in the folks who will be impacted. And this is one of my favorite things to do, is to build participation around the design process. Because we often think that we valorize solo genius, but being able to discuss, even what I would call stupid questions of how things work and how these things work for different people is much richer when we're able to bring other folks to the table. Next, one of the tenets of service design, and of course, as a transportation geek, I will admit that this is something that I love, is the idea of visual sequence. Service design is sequenced. So we visualize sequences and journeys, and we visualize the long-term outcomes of, that will result from our design decisions throughout the process of use. And this is something that we often overlook in the development process, is this idea of maintenance. But I don't have to tell a room full of JavaScript developers that, how code is maintained makes a huge difference in the long-term experience. And the last, is this the last one? No, the second to last tenet of service design is that it's evidencing, that we use context to see elements of a service. One of the great examples of this is how Apple marketed FaceTime towards absentee fathers. However, in showing folks that they could talk to children who were elsewhere, they presented a use case for FaceTime that did a much better job than any sort of documentation could. And lastly, we want to take a holistic approach when designing services. And it's this before, during, and after. And this leads me to a final point, is that we cannot be thinking about ourselves today and what we need in the current moment. We need to be thinking 10 and 20 years down the line to this next generation of developers. And not only advocating for them, but building much better tools for them. Because this leads me to my final question. Why are we doing this again? Why are we all here? Why are we trying to build better frameworks? Why are we trying to improve the performance of our teams? And it's because making things is fun. And making new things is fun. And breaking the mold of what we're making is fun. I really have enjoyed the work that's gone on through Fog Creek and their tool Glitch. And this idea that we can have a different sort of developer experience that's co-creative, that allows us to ask for help in ways that isn't embarrassing, that rewards our curiosity and rewards our mistakes. And how do we bring that not just to our own work, but to the tools we make for other folks? I don't really know the answer to that question, and I don't have any silver bullets in that regard. But I think that this is important work, and I think it's important for us to do it together. So come find me. I'll be around for the next few days. I have stickers, and I'd love to chat with you all. Thank you.